The MCU ended its first saga with a bang, finishing things off better than anyone could have ever imagined with Avengers Endgame. A year and a half later, WandaVision began airing, marking the beginning of Phase 4, which is the first phase to include Disney Plus shows alongside the theatrically released movies, and the phase ended up including probably more content than the first 3 phases combined. And in just 2 years, not only were there now more projects in this phase compared to the rest, giving us 18 different projects, with half of them also being triple the length, those being the Disney Plus shows, and while 2 of them are half the length, those being the specials, there are only 2 of them, and the phase was the shortest one yet, being only 2 calendar years. Now, I personally love the fact that we're basically getting something new almost every single week, but I do completely understand the feeling of oversaturation. I can understand the people who are now having a harder time keeping up with this universe, compared to Phase 3, where it was much simpler. You only had to watch 2 or 3 movies a year. And it's undeniable that Phase 4 has been the most controversial phase of the MCU so far, with the aforementioned complaints about the oversaturation or going for quantity over quality, as well as some less valid complaints like all the MCU nonsense, but it's undeniable that there are a lot more complaints about this phase compared to the rest. And again, I do understand why. I think Phase 4 has some huge misses, and a lot of them were actually in a row, like getting Ms. Marvel, Thor: Love and Thunder, and She-Hulk back to back to back, and they're all pretty bad, each one arguably worse than the last. But even so, the question is Phase 4 really that much worse than the rest of the cinematic universe? Well, I wanted to find out, and I came up with a method to do so that incorporates the audience's consensus, the critics, as well as my own personal opinion, because this is my channel, and most of the time if I do a ranking, it's just my opinion. This time I wanted to include the consensus of the critics and the general audience as well, so I created a formula using my own personal opinion for any given movie, TV show, or special, combined with the Rotten Tomatoes score of the property divided by 10, because it isn't a decibel, it's out of 100, but that is another third of the average. The last third is an average between the audience score on Rotten Tomatoes as well as the IMDB score, and I'm taking the average of the two and not just one of them because I feel like they're very susceptible to being review bombed, but if I take the average between the two, I think that's closer to the actual general consensus of the audience. So basically, I take the average of my opinion, the critic's opinion, and the general audience's opinion to see the average of each movie, and then also the average of each phase, to find out if Phase 4 is actually worse than the rest. So for example, let's take the latest MCU property, Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. On Rotten Tomatoes, the movie has an 85% critic score and a 95% audience score, and on IMDb it has a 7.5 out of 10. My personal opinion is I'd give it an 8 out of 10, so taking the average between the IMDb score and the critic score, we get an 8.5, and then adding on top of that the 85 from Rotten Tomatoes score divided by 10, so that's an 8.5, plus the score of my own personal opinion of an 8 out of 10, we get a grand total of 25. Taking the average, however, which is divided by 3, we get an 8.33333, which we can round down to an 8.3, which gives us the score for that specific movie. I did this for every movie and TV show and property in the main MCU, which, like I said, includes the critics' consensus, the audience's consensus, and a splash of my own personal opinion, because this is my channel. Then I took the averages of each phase, and as it turns out, Phase 4 doesn't actually have the lowest score. Phase 1 does. Phase 1 is helped by the Avengers and Iron Man, bringing up the score with an 8.716 and 8.63 respectively, but the rest either fail to affect the average all that much, or they bring it down considerably, like The Incredible Hulk and Iron Man 2. The average score for Phase 1 ended up being 7.454, which we can round up to 7.5, but we shouldn't, because all the phases are so close in ranking that rounding up or down almost defeats the purpose of this average, as it would really be so close to the score of Phase 4. Speaking of Phase 4, it isn't the worst, but it is in third place, or second to last, really helped out by Spider-Man: No Way Home, which ended up being the second highest average of any movie in the MCU, with an average of 9.12. But considering the sheer amount of content in this phase, each individual property has a bit less effect on the average than they did in the first 3 phases, especially in the first 2, which only have 6 properties each. And This phase is very weighed down by the likes of She-Hulk, Thor Love and Thunder, Eternals, Ms. Marvel, and Black Widow, all of which have an average under 7.0. The average for Phase 4 is actually 7.578, which is over a decimal point higher than Phase 1, but it is very close between the two. Phase 2 has an average of 7.802, landing it in second place, over 2 decimal points higher than Phase 4, so it's not as close to Phase 4 as Phase 4 is to Phase 1, and unsurprisingly, far and away the best average for a phase, and it's not even close, is Phase 3, which only has a single movie with an average under 7, that being Captain Marvel, and it also has the single highest average for any movie, that being Avengers Endgame, with a whopping average of 9.336. Overall, the average for Phase 4 is much higher than the rest, sitting very pretty at a very solid average of 8.304, which is 5 decimal points higher than second place. The fact that Marvel had such an incredible, consistent 4 years, firing on all cylinders for this amount of time, is absolutely incredible, but that may just be one of the reasons Phase 4 is so controversial. First of all, because it's coming off the back of the incredible third phase, so it's bound to be compared to it, but also because of the lack of general consistency with this phase. For instance, Phase 1 doesn't really reach the highs that Phase 4 reaches, but it doesn't reach the lows either, so despite arguably being on par with Phase 1 and having like the same average, it's looked upon far less favorably due to its low lows and its inconsistency. If, for example, She-Hulk and Love and Thunder were a bit better, while No Way Home and Wakanda Forever were a bit worse, just as an example, then maybe Phase 4 would be looked upon more favorably if there were less high highs and less low lows and more highs and slightly lows, because then I think that people would focus more on the average between the two instead of focusing on the bad, which is what people are mostly doing, or at least that's what it seems to me. Because in my opinion, there is a lot of good in Phase 4, but I do agree that there is a good amount of bad as well. Now, this isn't the only reason that Phase 4 is looked upon unfavorably currently. There is another one, and that's the lack of direction, or at least the seeming lack of direction that Phase 4 has. And yeah, if you look at that concept and compare Phases 1 and 4, then it isn't really any contest, as Phase 1 had this miraculous feat of creating the foundation of the MCU, something that so many other cinematic universes have attempted to do but failed, and Phase 1 succeeded, while also having kind of a season-long storyline arc leading into the epic finale, which both of those things Phase 4 lacks. I don't fully agree with this point, as Phase 4 doesn't need to build up any foundation other than the foundation of the story of the next saga, which I think that in terms of that foundation, it does pretty much do successfully. I do think that the through line of the multiverse and setting up Kang successfully connects a lot of what makes up this phase. I mean, you got Loki, What If, Spider-Man No Way Home, which in and of itself connects to Multiverse of Madness, which also connects to WandaVision, plus you got Wong popping up everywhere. I get that there isn't an Avengers movie that it's all leading up to, but it isn't leading up to the Avengers movie in this phase, it's leading up to the Avengers movie in Phase 6, so there's a lot of building up to do, which was a decision that might have came at the detriment of the phase itself, as maybe people just aren't patient enough to wait until that movie comes out in a couple of years to feel the build-up leading to something, and I kind of agree with that a bit, as I feel like this phase did need an Avengers movie. As it stands, it's the only one to not have one. Phase 3 had 2 of them, and it was sorely lacking, not only because the phase feels like it's ending at a very arbitrary time. I mean, you got Black Panther Wakanda Forever, and then the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special, which for some reason end the phase, but also because an Avengers movie takes away from that feeling of directionlessness, because that is what it's all building up to, and it's not going to be out in a couple years, it's going to be out now, as the Avengers movies kind of feel like checkpoints before you get to the final boss. Like, you need something in the middle to break up the segments, because as it stands, there won't really be much of a difference between phases 4 and 5, as they're both leading into the same exact thing. Plus, we never saw most of the Phase 4 characters teaming up with each other, so it feels like less of a connected universe maybe. At least that is partially one of the reasons that the general audience felt a bit disconnected to Phase 4 compared to the rest. I personally think it does feel like a bit more of a universe and not just a TV show, which is maybe for better or for worse in terms of your own opinion, but I do think that it is pretty cool. In general, however, in my opinion, Phase 4 is maybe the worst phase of the MCU. That's definitely arguable, and I won't be offended if you think that it is. I think that it is definitely an argument to be made that it is. But it has a higher average than Phase 4. That doesn't account for the general structure of the phase and how much it contributes to the universe, for which Phase 1 would get huge points, so I'm not sure which phase is better. But all that being said, that's not to say it's bad. It might be the worst phase in the universe, but none of the phases are bad. There's nothing inherently wrong with Phase 4. Is it as good as Phase 3? No, not even close. But, like, literally nothing is as good as Phase 3, and it's unfair to compare this transitional phase to the culmination of the last saga. Phase 3 was an unprecedented cinematic achievement, and to trash the MCU for not living up to the godhood level of expectation that came out of that phase is completely unfair. Aside from Thor Love and Thunder and maybe She-Hulk, those are pretty trash, but Phase 4 is perfectly fine. It's still miles better than any other attempt at a cinematic universe, and I'm still loving the fact that we're getting something new almost every week, and I'm very hyped for the rest of this universe and what it's all leading up to. Oh, and if you wanted to hear the ratings of if you wanted to see the ratings for each one of these movies and TV shows, I'll go over them pretty quickly from worst to best. On screen right now, you can see the bottom 10 with Thor Love and Thunder, She-Hulk Attorney at Law, and Eternals all being in the bottom 3. Next, we have the bottom middle 10, which is just the next 10 on the list. It's just what the section is called. I wanted to do 10 at a time. And then you have the top middle, it's not 10, it's actually 9 movies before we get to the actual top 10, which starts with Iron Man, then Spider-Man Far From Home, WandaVision, The Avengers, Avengers Infinity War, and in the top 5, Loki, Captain America the Winter Soldier, Captain America Civil War, Spider-Man No Way Home, and Avengers Endgame. I didn't include I Am Groot because, if I'm being honest, I don't really know how to rate that, and it's not really comparable to the rest of the MCU at all. It's just a bunch of shorts, and obviously the holiday special, despite coming out in Phase 4, it wasn't in this video at all, and I know I maybe could have waited until that was out to make this video, but I don't think the holiday special, unless it's incredible or awful, will have any effect on the overall average, which, if you wanted to know what the overall average of the entire MCU was, the average, rounded down because it is closer to the lower number than the higher, is a 7.78, which honestly is basically exactly what I expected. For me, basically the MCU is pretty much a 7.5 most of the time, or at least that's the average of MCU movies. A lot of them are a lot higher, some of them are a little bit lower, but a 7.5 is what most of them are, or at least a large portion of them, so a 7.78 is actually a bit higher than I would have expected, and it's a very solid average, in my opinion. Anyway, that's it for this video. Make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and bye.